Ali, my first question is for you. It's been an amazing year of change at AOL, so I just want to talk a little bit about that. Arguably, from an AOL perspective, your greatest successes have been either side of the Time Warner merger. You've gone through some incredible change, particularly in the last few years, shown a lot of agility, integrated some amazing businesses. Of course, you now find yourself part of a bigger business again, Verizon. And I thought I'd just ask you, how do you see the agility that served you so well playing out in the context of being part of a bigger group? And does the scale that brings, to some degree, offset maybe a loss of agility?
Yeah. It's interesting. I felt a very light touch from Verizon, which I think is by design in their part because the business that we're in is quite different than Verizon's core business, although connected to its future, which is fantastic. The agility that has helped AOL pivot and turn around so quickly, in particular while being public on the market, right? Going through a turnaround privately is hard. Going through a turnaround publicly is excruciating. And so we're really proud of being able to be very nimble and at the same time focused on a long-term goal. And so in marketing and communications, I'm a massive NBA basketball fan. Not a happy NBA basketball fan today because I'm not a big LeBron fan. But
so you're, just for the record, you're a Celtics fan.
I'm a huge Celtics fan, parlayed into a big Warriors fan in the finals. So it's a sad day. Good thing it was 2 a.m. last night when the game was played. But we've talked a lot. I'm a follower of Phil Jackson, who's a longtime acclaimed NBA coach of the Bulls and of the Lakers. And we apply his triangle offense actually pretty deeply in our own team. And the premise of it is, at the heart of it is training everybody in their swim lane to really react to what's going on in the market quickly without having to necessarily come back and reevaluate the strategy every time. So our teams are really deeply focused on, here's what I know I need to achieve. And ultimately, depending on what a competitor does, depending on where the market shifts, depending on how fast mobile accelerates, depending on what assets we bring in, everybody kind of knows then how to pivot and actually just move very nimbly. And that has been, that allows us to do things at scale really quickly without having to compromise time. And at the end of the day, accelerating our ability to move quickly, that's the only thing that has mattered to us. I mean, we'd be willing to take 85-90% readiness to speed any day of the week. Yeah.
And when you, just sort of playing off that, when you thought about, back when the Verizon deal was first on the table, do you think about, were you framing it in terms of the type of company that we would want to work with, the type of company we want to be acquired with has to have scale, but also the ability to enable us to continue to do what we're doing? Does that frame the conversation?
I think we wanted to be where what we brought to the table was unique and valuable, but I think most important was its future, right? So we look at where Verizon wants to go long term and how we fit into that, and we love that they see technology as the underpinning of everything that they want to do, the consumer at the very front of everything that they do, and they've got tremendous and scaled strong consumer relationships domestically and partner connected consumer relationships outside the US, and then that our content brands are a path for them to deepen and strengthen those relationships and the continued investments they're doing around that. So for us, it was this perfect match of not a lot of duplication, but a hugely shared vision. And so it's been a fantastic marriage so far.
Great.
Yeah.
Thank you. Philip, I want to come on to you. We mentioned there was a conversation there about content brands that came up. Part of your business, clearly a very strong branded content business. I'm fascinated to see that last year you launched in the UK last year, and Germany this year. So you are expanding globally. And I'm interested from your perspective, is that an attempt to get scale? Is that all about, look, we want to build out our international presence because that gives us scale? Or is it actually better if it's seen as a reflection of your agility to be able to respond to market opportunities wherever in the world they may go?
Right. It's a little bit of both. So to us, we define scale really as obviously our ability to reach audiences, to monetize those audiences, but also to be culturally relevant. to have cultural influence, and that's extremely important to us because just being a scale player is not sufficient. And for our business, engagement and depth of engagement with an audience is probably the single most important thing. So the things that are driving us in our international expansion right now are serving local audiences that already exist in those markets. So the UK was a big market, Germany was a big market. India, for example, is another big market for us where we already have an audience. We're not there yet, but it's on the horizon. Then second, being able to move into markets, into local markets, especially into cities where we see the opportunity to create really a network effect, where there is content coming out of that market that becomes globally relevant for an audience, right? This is a consumer base that thinks more globally than any generation before it. And third, for us, branded content, you mentioned that model. Where do we see an opportunity to push into a market where that's emerging or already flourishing? So in the UK, obviously it makes sense. Germany, for example, super traditional market where that is going to flip. And we see that on the horizon already. So that's really, for us, driving how we think about international expansion and what markets we're going to go into next. The final point here is that for us, it's not a sort of one-size-fits-all approach. Just because we went into those two markets in relatively traditional ways of a full operation in the UK and in Germany that really mirrors what we set up in the US, obviously smaller. Some other markets that we're thinking about might be very, very different. Germany, UK are playing into our history as a publisher as well as a video brand. In some future markets that we're considering, we might go as a non-text model and pursue just a video play, which could look very different than what we have currently.
But playing on that, you then look at the business and say, this is, and always has been, destined to be an international business, that you look at the world and say, there is an opportunity for Refinery 29 on a global basis.
100%.
Yeah.
I mean, it's like, personally, I started this business 10 years ago with a local mission grounded in Brooklyn and New York. That was about like a very specific moment that was happening there. 10 years later, it's a global conversation. Our mission is to empower, inspire, important conversations for women around the world, and it's a global moment. That's as relevant in South Africa or India or Turkey or Mexico. And that for that purpose, it's really important for us to say, hey, we're going to expand this business globally into all the markets where we should be playing, but with very different approaches based on what market we're going into, how people are consuming there, how brands are spending money there.
Women are different everywhere. Just kidding. We like different things all over the world.
That's a different topic.
Surprising we're not all the same. Yeah, no, just kidding.
Scott, I'd be really interested in your perspective on this, because there's sort of a common consensus, I guess, that agility and scale don't work well. You get big and you lose agility, and you can only really be agile if you're a kind of startup. But then I think back to a presentation you give about the Gang of Four, about where the first $1 trillion market cap company is going to come from, and you list that it might be one of Apple, Amazon, Facebook, or Google, I think. And you look at those businesses and you say they have scale and they are incredibly agile, right? And that ability to get to $1 trillion in market cap is driven partly by their ability to react to what's going on in the marketplace. So I'd be interested in your view. Are those businesses unique? Have they found the magic formula that says you can be both agile and scale? Or are we at a point in the marketplace where eventually they will get disrupted just like everybody else?
So, agility and scale. A couple of the good management, having accountability, entrepreneurial focus, all those things make a company more agile. I think Facebook is arguably the most agile company, over $1 billion in revenue in the world. If you look at their product roadmap and their ability to do stuff and fail and then perform infanticide and put out new things, they are more agile than, I would argue, almost any small startup. They look at something, they go after it, they measure it, and then they pull the plug on it if it's not working, and if it is working, they pour more fuel behind it. I think the word, in terms of creating shareholder value, is scale means getting to a certain point where all of a sudden you get benefits, you can leverage the fixed costs you make and the variable costs, cover those, and then you start making a lot of money. And I would argue that the marketplace is rewarding momentum more than quote-unquote scale, and that as you paint a vision that you're going to get to scale of something amazing, and you show more momentum than any player in the marketplace, which gives you access to cheaper and cheaper capital, which means, quite frankly, you can create a business model that requires such immense scale that only one player, i.e. you, can get there. So we have a system where it's becoming, Amazon took $2 billion to get to break even. And every new entrant, Uber's probably going to raise $30 billion before it gets to break even. We have an economy where every time there's a sector that's worthwhile going after, the incumbent raises so much capital and offers such an unbelievable consumer value proposition, more for less, that the level of scale you need to get to is so extraordinary that effectively one player goes out and raises more capital, which turns into the largest oxygen tank in the sector, goes underwater, forces everybody else to follow them, but they have to go underwater with a smaller tank, and they drown. It's a last man standing strategy to get to that scale, which everyone is pushing further and further out. By the way, it's terrible for the economy. It results in job destruction, and it leads to very, a winner-take-all, get-rich-or-die trying kind of economy. But I think the key word is more momentum to raise cheap capital to get to that scale.
Momentum, not scale.
Well, look at
Momentum
Amazon.
with scale.
Amazon has traded off profits for vision and growth. They've said to investors, we're not going to be profitable, we're going to grow faster and give you vision, and you're going to give me more and more capital. Amazon trades at 70 times EBITDA, most retailers trade at 70. So Amazon can build warehouses to get all of us deliveries within an hour, which is unsustainable economically for anybody but Amazon. Mickey Drexler summarized it perfectly. How do you compete with a large company that doesn't want to make money? So scale, if you will, keeps getting pushed out further and further by the one player who has the access to the cheapest capital.
And that two things strike me about what you said. The winner takes all thing's really interesting. Can that is that sustainable? Do we get to a situation where the winner takes all, and then the natural evolution of technology means that ultimately you then get disrupted by somebody who comes from left field? Or can you create in this global economy now such a strong position in that winner takes all market that you become very hard to disrupt?
So I believe the algorithm for long-term shareholder value is to use digital moats. So use cloud computing, Amazon Web Service, outsourced computing, access to capital so you can scale really fast. The problem is the same things that put you out in front as fast, someone in a dorm room at MIT can leverage and disrupt you. So the best players use digital moats, and then as soon as they have access to cheap capital, they start building analog walls. So Amazon builds warehouses. Apple may have a better phone than Samsung, it may not, but their barrier of entry against Samsung is they have 850 stores in 18 markets that will take 10 or 20 years to replace. Samsung has shitty distribution that denigrates their brand every time you walk into an AT&T store and have to learn about a phone with a guy with a name tag on who doesn't know what he's talking about. Facebook is laying pipe across the Atlantic. So if Snapchat gets hotter and hotter it can and starts to disrupt Facebook, fine, but they're not going to have a pipe on the floor of the Atlantic disrupting broadband. The idea is raise money using digital scale and then go and build these analog moats that are much harder to replicate. Google is laying fiber down across America.
Okay. Tom, I'll come on to you. We've talked a little bit about sort of different business models. We've talked about agility and scale. It's interesting for me. In 2013, Netflix CEO Reed Hastings famously said he wanted to build Netflix into a company that resembled a premium cable network. Shane Smith at Vice has talked about the fact that he wants Vice either to be, I think he said, the next CNN or the next MTV. And what's interesting about that is using reference points for businesses that have or do already exist. So my question for you is, when you look at those business models, I know you've looked at streaming in some detail, do you see a new business model emerging that's different to what went before, or are we seeing companies coming along that actually look quite a lot like the companies that went before?
Well, it is true that the companies, Netflix and HBO in particular, are more and more looking the same. And Reed Hastings said, we want to be like HBO, but faster than HBO can be Netflix-like. And they've succeeded, and they have things in common. They have proprietary content. And it used to be that the Netflix model was very different from the HBO model. Netflix is what you get through the set-top box, and Netflix was the thing that you got over the internet. But you see that the two models or the distinction, the boundaries are blurring. That Netflix is now integrated in the set-top boxes in Europe with Bouygues and LGI and Virgin Media, and that HBO is going over the top. So the models start to get very, very similar. Yet we discussed agility and scale. I think Netflix is much more agile because it has a direct relationship with the consumer, while HBO is tied hand and feet to other players like the cable carriers, the MVPDs, and it can't take any initiative without the approval of the MVPDs, because it's bound hand and feet to the MVPDs. So I don't, like you said, Scott, I don't think there is a conflict between scale and agility. There is a conflict, agility depends in the first place on to the extent to which you can operate almost independently from other players, and HBO is in that respect much less agile than a Netflix because of the operating model. Yeah.
Philip, I'm interested, when you set up and you co-founded Refinery 29, when you were in the process of creating that business, did you look at other players in the marketplace and say, broadly, I want to create a company that looks a little bit like that? Or did you come at it from a perspective that says, what's out there currently is not working for consumers, I want to create something completely new?
And not to sound like the typical startup guy, there wasn't, the businesses that we were aiming to disrupt were not in a place where they were innovating at all, right? I mean, these were traditional publishers who, by the way, on the international side of things, had been handing over their businesses to licensors decade after decade, so they weren't actually running their business internationally. They weren't actually able to build their brand the same way of Netflix going up on stage and saying, we're now in 180 countries, right? So titles like Vogue, other people run in other companies run in other countries. So no, that definitely wasn't a world that we're trying to emulate. I think for us, it's always been about carving a path and seeing the opportunity sort of evolve in front of us. Like 5 years ago, 6 years ago, we weren't particularly aggressive about international because the pipes weren't actually there. By the way, we talked a lot about pipes or brand, right? So there's new pipes now, so the how in which you actually deliver content is different. But in terms of the why, and going back to your question about Shane talking about CNN or Reed Hastings talking about HBO, the why of creating great, amazing brands and content is actually still the same, right? So the framework of just how you're delivering it has changed dramatically. And for us, we've got an amazing brand that means something for women around the world, and how we can deliver that now is dramatically different. And 5 years ago, we wouldn't have been able to think about it that way.
And it's interesting to you say that. Of course, my current employer, The Economist, we've had a global brand for quite a long time.
Right.
We didn't go down that path of licensing, but it took a long time in the old world to build that global footprint.
Yeah.
It was a long and very expensive and time-consuming process. You look at the world now, though, and you can do that much more quickly.
Right.
I mean, we did that with the Huffington Post. I mean, they went global in 34 markets in under a year.
Yeah.
And it is, and I do think there's a trade-off in depending on how you want to operate in those markets. So to the Amazon point, if you're willing to operate unprofitably in order to build a brand, that's very different than trying to scale a profitable business globally. That is not a trivial aim because of the differences in market, because of the cultural differences. Like that is an incredibly daunting task without it being completely technology-based today.
There too, with the Huffington Post, you see that there was a time where the New York Times model was very, very different from the Huffington Post model, but you see that these models are more and more integrated and more look alike, and that New York Times incorporates elements from the Huffington Post and vice versa.
Yeah.
Well, that's what interests me about AOL, Ali, is that you actually, I guess there's more of it now, but it was quite unusual to have a content business or content businesses and a technology platform side by side. You look at those and genuinely say either you're a platform or you're a content business.
Yeah.
To what extent is that fundamental to your business model going forward? Because it's interesting, again, don't want to keep coming back to Verizon, but interesting in the context of Verizon. I think you guys have said the content businesses are still a really important part of the business.
Absolutely.
Why is that?
Yeah, I mean, I think we've marketed it as culture and code for quite some time. Culture, big investments in brands on one side, which we were highly criticized for many years. But I think the market is coming back around and really seeing the value in those early investments, particularly in brands like the Huffington Post, TechCrunch, Makers. And then on the code side, big technology platforms, and those were oftentimes kept very separately, right? Our brands that wanted to do business with us, our brand customers that wanted to do business with us on the culture side often didn't abandon us on the code side, and vice versa. And now I think what you're seeing is that shift for code to kind of underpin all of everything we do on the brand side. So they're more interconnected than ever, and we are, I don't see that in any way changing, just deepening. I think you see new technologies like VR being plugged into that platform and unleashed across this massive portfolio of brands that extends to everything from Huffington Post to Go90, which is a new platform of Verizon. So I think there will be no building a brand going forward without technology. I think that is the opportunity loss of leaving data on the table is not worth any brand going to market to really compete in a category without that.
But what's fascinating at the same time is that 5 years ago you could enter the media landscape and say you're disrupting by having the world's best CMS, by saying that you could distribute content anywhere in the world. And right, as distribution has really moved into the realm of 3 or 4 players that handle most of the world's distribution, that conversation has changed, because all of a sudden it's no longer about getting people to your .com and monetizing the ads around it. It's actually monetizing the content itself on the platforms that actually distribute it. And that's been a huge change.
Well, the off-network, off-platform distribution model and formats, right? I think that will be the next wave of advertising that brands and agencies have to face and deal with, is how are we going to creatively work between content owners and distribution platforms, primarily social and mobile distribution platforms, and figure out what's a format that's compelling enough for me to invest in, right? First, as a brand, and 2, how do I do that ubiquitously across publishers? Because that's been a historical problem in terms of standard optimization. I mean, we're back in that new realm of, okay, what's now? How do we enter a new standard setting cycle around ads?
That is probably the biggest trend in the last 2 years is content is not only distributed on own platforms anymore, but is more and more distributed on third-party platforms.
Almost entirely.
Almost entirely.
Yeah.
With Facebook, of course, one being one of the most players, and the demand, or the big question for the content creators is, do I have content that can be monetized not only on my platform but on third-party platforms? And that is more and more the big question.
Well, it goes to your agility question, and I think just a general DNA, like the notion of corporate mindset inside, and you were talking about competing against other women's publishing organizations that just weren't ready mentally to make that shift. Making a shift to off-network, off-platform distribution and monetization is a mental change you have to get comfortable with to open your doors up. So agility is as much a mindset inside a company, to be flexible, to be open, to not be fixed. And I think that then spans to how we recruit for talent, how we look at that. I mean, it's a fascinating time in our industry. Yeah.
I just want to switch gears a little bit. We started to talk, we focused very much on the kind of content side, the platform side, mentioned agencies, we started to talk a little bit about the sort of advertising side. I was interested to read, Scott, in the PwC report, there's an interesting section of it that talks about the advertising industry and says, look, actually all the disruption that's going on, programmatic data, all of those things, could be seen as being very challenging for the existing advertising ecosystem. But it then goes on to say, but actually you might look at it and say, this could be a real opportunity. Big holding companies bringing together lots of different disciplines under one roof. I think you famously talked about the end of the advertising industrial complex. What's your view now on what these changes that we're seeing mean from the advertising side of this industry? Do you still stand by the fact that the advertising industry as a whole is going to be significantly disrupted?
Yeah, I think advertising is effectively becoming a tax that the poor and the technologically illiterate pay. I think similar to how in the US we become numb to mass shootings, we become numb to just how awful most advertising is. If I look at broadcast TV, it's telling me that I'm in the market for an Android phone, a car from South Korea, a light beer, that I'm bipolar, and that I have restless leg syndrome. The traditional broadcast ad interruption industrial complex is in structural decline. If consumers continue to cut the cord the way they're cutting the cord, in 7 years you're going to have more people with subscriptions to Amazon than cable TV. If you look at where we're headed from a consumer standpoint, we're going to a pay and avoid model. People are downloading Modern Family off of iTunes for $2.99, whereas they could get it just as quickly off of ABC On Demand. so they can avoid the commercials. Advertising globally is flat. The transition or the reallocation out of traditional broadcast media, which is where the agencies make most of their money, is going to digital. That arbitrage, 90% of that arbitrage is being scooped up by two players, Facebook and Google. Australia is a metaphor for what will happen to the rest of the ad agency industrial complex. You had a $13 billion ecosystem, all the media, newspapers, TV agencies in 2010. It's growing to $20 billion in 2020, about a 3 or 4% growth rate. In 2010, the global tech companies, Facebook, Google, LinkedIn, were taking out $1.5 billion. By 2020, they'll take out approximately 13. So the total pie that the ad agency industrial complex was fighting for in Australia is going from 13 billion to 6 billion. So I believe that the big ad agency conglomerates who have a lot of fantastic assets will be broken up into big bank, bad bank, where you have your legacy profitable assets that aren't growing but are in structural decline, and then they'll spin off their growth assets because the whole market will punish the entire conglomerate strategy. I think you can effectively tell what's going to happen to you next year and can based on your business card. If you're working for a big holding company, it means you'll likely be back next year, and you'll be, if you're great at what you do, you'll be promoted because the innovation inside these big companies now is figuring out a way for people to do more on less pay. So you'll be back, you'll just have more responsibility, you'll be working harder and spending less time with your family. If you're at a digital agency, the people who are really getting hurt are the digital agencies. That 10%, you have 90% of the growth being soaked up by two players, so you have 3,000 other digital marketing companies, all these cats and dogs running around here. If you're carrying a card from a digital marketing firm that's doesn't say Google or Facebook on it, you will be back but likely working for another company. It's going to be chaos in that industry and huge decline, disruption. And if you work for Facebook and Google, your parties are going to get better and better and your DJs more and more famous.
Well, on that positive, Tom, I think you've got something to say on that.
No, I fundamentally share your vision on TV advertising, that there is a lot of waste with TV advertising. Yet what I see, that waste has been in existence for ages. Mm-hmm. And you would expect that with the current capabilities and assets there are in digital advertising, that TV advertising will be in huge decline. Yes, yet in the United States it's even growing. It's growing by 3, 4, 5% a year. So there seem to be huge mobility barriers at work for the TV advertising industry not to decline. And the big question to me is, and cord cutting as well, cord shaving, everybody is talking about cord cutting and cord shaving, yet the number of pay TV subscriptions is about stable in the US. I don't see any significant cord cutting in my data, mostly in the US. So there's a lot of talk, and then there are the facts. And they say that TV advertising is going to decline, it's going to fall off a cliff. It's not. They say that pay TV subscription are going to fall off a cliff. They're not. So there seem to be mobility barriers, and I think the mobility barriers are mainly to be, I think, to a large extent, in the advertising agencies and the compensation structure they have. So it might take a while before the changes in consumer behavior are being reflected in the changes in the advertising.
It's a great point. I've been talking about the death of television for 2 years, and I've been terribly wrong. Super Bowl ads are up 8% this year. I personally believe similar to when someone's dying and they have that sudden burst of energy right at the end of their life and they go back into bed and die right away. That's where we are in the TV ecosystem right now.
I heard from the upfronts now in New York that are taking place in New York, the prices are up 8% versus the previous year.
I think it's a last gasp. You had the last hurrah with the election, with the World Cup, and then people are going to realize that they are way overpaying. I think there's a lot of companies, the biggest advertisers in the world, are all losing share. 90% of the top 100 CPG brands have lost share. 2/3 have lost revenue. There is a correlation between how much you're advertising and your lack of innovation. And a lot of these companies who are in flat growth are trying to jumpstart growth by throwing money at broadcast, and they're recognizing it's not working. I think we're going to see a decline, a structural decline, like you haven't seen in media. Having said that, I've been wrong, and what you're saying is right so far. The numbers so far are on your side.
And the other thing is that there's still a big mistrust about digital advertising. People don't fully understand it. I heard about an experiment that one of the biggest newspapers in the UK ran. Because it runs advertising on its for its newspaper on other sides. So at one point in time, I decided we're going to run ads, our own ads, on our own newspaper site. So it started to buy through the different SSPs and DSPs and real-time bidding platforms, advertising space on its own property. And of the $100 that it spent on buying that advertising, it got $15 back. So in the entire, there is a conception in the market that TV advertising is very lucrative to the advertising agency. Well, but it could be, but nobody exactly knows that even digital advertising is even more profitable, but nobody fully understands the economics of digital advertising.
Well, and the interesting thing on that from our perspective is that from The Economist, of course, you know, we carry advertising. Digital advertising in all its forms is a core part of our business model, but in many ways, just as transformative for us has been the ability to change our subscription marketing activity from what was basically analog, so direct mail, to digital. And that has driven a huge shift in our business because the cost of acquisition has fallen dramatically.
Right.
Of course, that all flows to the bottom line.
But I think to your point on how bad digital advertising is and how bad those formats are, you know, advertisers, I think there's two elements that are contributing that would say maybe you're both right, right? Which is the inertia inside of a traditional marketer that needs to change this massive amount of budget. It's like halting a freight train, right? That is so much momentum, so much inertia, so much history that it's always gone this fast, it's always gone this way. That stopping that or reversing that is so scary internally. It is personally threatening to everyone involved because when they stop that, what does that mean? Do they get to relearn? Do they have to rethink? Or does it just not become, does it get put into product innovation because consumers are rewarding value versus marketing?
Or retail promotion.
Or point of purchase, point of sale, in-store, whatever. That's like a very scary, just organizational, like people talk about the jobs that will be most sought after. I actually think like organizational change and change management experts will become the new marketers, to be honest. But then ad format innovation in mobile in particular, like the way marketers are able to distribute their messages. And I think that's why you see this huge branded content growth of them trying to become like a journalist, right?
Yeah.
That's sharing great information and great content, but that's not solved. That's not anywhere near solved. So the notion of saying if you're a massive Fortune 100 consumer marketer, we're going to take away TV and I have no other way to share my brand message in a way that like I can't give you anything close that's going to represent our brand as well. That's like saying, you know, we're going to take all your baby's clothes away. We're not going to give you anything to send your kid to pre-K in. Like it's just never, you're not going to no one's sending their kid to pre-K naked. It's never going to happen. Yeah.
Philip,
I got to answer to this one too, because generally my life stance is to be an optimist. Consumers, at least the ones that we speak to, they actually passionately care about brands. They just don't want to be bullshitted, and they don't want to be served stuff they don't interact with. Like when was the last time like a consumer in their late teens or 20s watched a 30-second ad clip? Like never. It doesn't happen. It doesn't work for them, right? And they certainly are not looking at banner advertising that's running on a website. So I think that your point is right, but on the one hand, what you're describing is really a paradigm that is on its last breath, will sort of fundamentally be disrupted. It's a $7 billion industry, just TV advertising, not any of the affiliate fees, right? And it's serving something that just doesn't work. At the same time, the amount of time consumed digitally is up so dramatically through all the devices, through all the content that people are watching through Facebook and Snapchat and everything else, and they're not even yet consuming content on their self-driving cars, which they will also be in the next few years. So it's just that there is no solution yet to something that is fundamentally broken, and certainly marketers need to jump on board in actually figuring out how do I get my message to come through and how do I need to connect in a way, and connecting is never going to go out of business.
No, but
That's
they
why-
don't.
Go ahead.
They don't. I think the issue, to your point, there's no solution. We are, our industry is really putting itself in jeopardy because when you think about early days of television, right? Who created the first TV spot? Well, it was P&G. Who created the first soap opera? It was P&G as a carrier for their commercial, right? So they said, okay, well, let's create this really compelling content. Let's embed our soap ads in it or our tampon ads in it, and housewives will buy our ads because we're bringing them this great content. So from the very first day, as consumers were trained, this is how I get my content experience underwritten. This is how it happens. We have completely S the bed on that in digital. So unless we fix that soon, we are aggressively training every generation from here forward that they should just get content forever for free in any shape that they want. And the subscription model you're turning around is great, but my guess is your demographic is such that they've already associated there's a value or a premium on your paper, right? Mm-hmm. We have generations coming into the fold that do not believe anything should be paid for or anything should be underwritten. Like they're not being exposed to that ever. And so unless we figure out that ad model soon, that works for everybody, for consumers at the front of the bus and then brands at the back, we will be, I think the economics in our industry will no longer work.
Well, that's the big question. That really is. There's a fundamental shift in margin and economics in everybody's business right now, in a way that is really not yet contemplated about what the implications will be for that.
Yeah.
And I think of the new models, the jury is still out to come back to the premise of our point, whether they scale, right? That, you know, the great thing about the old ecosystem, TV advertising scales, right? And the new models are more challenging from that regard. Tom, you were going to say something then?
Yeah, that a lot needs to happen for a lot of alternative revenue sources need to be found in order for the current system to be viable in the future. You pay for your television content through your cable subscription. 40% of your cable subscription goes to the. If that disappears in the future, we need to find an alternative source of revenue. And the big question is whether it's $40 billion in the US, whether the CPMs can increase to such an extent that you can generate $40 billion with dynamically inserted advertising. That is a big question, and there's a lot of uncertainty there.
Yeah.
It's a lot of money.
It's a lot of money.
Conscious I am of time, I'm just going to ask you each one final very quick question. So the original premise of this discussion was, can agility and scale continue to coexist in this world of change that we've talked about? So I just want to come back to each of you. Tom, your view, can agility and scale coexist?
It can, I think so. They're not antithetical. I think what is more antithetical is agility stands at odds with the number of layers you have in your distribution system. The more layers you have in your distribution system, the less flexibility and the less agility you have.
Yeah.
Ali, for you?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's I don't think you have a choice. I think it will be the inability to move quickly will be the death of many traditional companies today.
Yeah, innovation is going to keep being rewarded, and I think agility, and to scale are not diametrically opposed. Agility is really sort of it needs a better word, which is really strategy. What's your strategy for scaling out into the world?
Scott?
We all knew mobile was coming 3 years ago. Most of us, all of our companies had 0% of our revenue from mobile, as did Facebook. Now they have 83% of the revenue coming from mobile. We all knew it was going to happen. They were just more agile than the rest of us. So I don't see the two. It's more about what you were talking about, great management, great culture, as opposed to size.
Great. So on that positive note, I think we're going to leave it there. Agility and scale can coexist. And based on Scott's point, I think we're all going to go and check our business cards to see how we can do that. But thank you very much to the panel for
Thank you.
insight.
Thank you.
And thank you all very much for
Thank you very much.